Hi, everyone. Welcome to Oyster River Pages Soundings. I'm Jonathan Freeman-Coppadge, fiction editor at Oyster River Pages. And today I am joined by Jonathan Parks-Ramage, coming to us from sunny Southern California, to talk about his forthcoming debut novel, Yes, Daddy, out from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt on May 18th, 2021. Congratulations to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan. I prefer having conversations with people who share my first name. It just
It
makes
is
things so much easier.
it's like talking in a mirror. I think the first time you and I met, we had, I think there was like some sort of walk off, or I don't know. It was a very dramatic competition to see who had the better name, and memory fails me, but I'm sure the right decision was made. So
I mean, it's all about Jonathan's with hyphenated last names.
it is.
You know
It
what I
is.
mean? There's a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah, I don't know if you've had this experience, but for most of my life, I've had people trying to pronounce the end or my given last name, Coppage, with a sort of French flair, Coppage. So I don't know if people are
Oh, yes.
Parks-Ramage. Is that
Yes, honey, people love a ramage. People love to make us French. I think because we just sound so fancy with the three names.
that's right. Well, I will go down and fix myself something French after this conversation. So thanks for making time to chat with us today. I would love maybe if you could just sort of give us a little bit of quick orientation to Yes, Daddy. Who, what, where.
Yeah, so Yes, Daddy is about a young, broke, struggling, aspiring writer who moves to New York City and uh, begins a relationship with a much older, wealthy, famous playwright. And he gets into this relationship and thinks essentially that he's made it and it's going to be, the answer to his prayers. But then the older, wealthy playwright invites him out to compound in the Hamptons for the summer, where things take a very dark and horrifying turn. That
Awesome. Yeah.
was it.
So let's start at the beginning. Your prologue is set in a courtroom, and our main character, Jonah, takes the witness stand in order to discredit the accusations of rape made against his abuser. And I'm not really giving anything away that you won't see in the first few pages. So,
Yeah, exactly.
and he's sitting there, sort of grappling with what to do. And he thinks, this is how I survive, by withholding my story. And it's a very, I think, conflicted moment for the reader, as well as someone who, is looking at this action, knowing the consequences of such an omission, and yet feeling the pain of Jonah's having to relive this scene. And I'm wondering, for you, when you sort of think of Jonah on that stand, to what extent do you think of, whether we call that a lie or omission, or lie by omission, as kind of a legitimate survival skill? And I guess the second question I have about that is, um, does it change our opinion of it, given the fact that he spends the next 280 pages telling us the story that he refuses to tell on the witness stand?
Right. I mean, I think that, anyone who's been through uh, any sort of trauma, I think that, which is, I mean, most people, I think that that impulse to repress, to lock that story away in a box, to pretend that it never happened, I think that that is very relatable. And I think that in many cases, it is necessary for survival to pretend like the worst thing that's ever happened to you has never happened. But at the same time, there are real consequences for yourself, sometimes for others, if if you're taking that trauma and you're pretending it never happened or denying it or repressing it, it can manifest itself in very toxic and harmful ways throughout your life. And I mean, you know, I am in therapy. I am a #1 therapy stan. Love it, love it, love it. And I think that, you know, one of the incredible things about therapy is the way it kind of forces you to examine your own life story, to examine, you know, the events of your life and how they have unfolded and how past events, relationships, traumas may be informing the way that you're moving through the world, and how you're interacting with other people and what you're doing, whether you're, you know, living in a positive way or enacting harm on others, and kind of forwarding that or transferring that trauma onto other people. And so I think for the character of Jonah, this book is a kind of a living document as he is finally kind of confronting his trauma, and confronting the ways in which he has not dealt with his trauma, and confronting the ways in which that lack of self-examination has resulted in harm to himself, to the people around him. And I think that that's really the challenge of the book. And I wanted to start out with that really kind of intense prologue because it immediately challenges the reader, you know, to think of the complexity of a character who has gone through trauma, who might not be acting in a quote unquote perfect or ideal manner, who's not dealing with their trauma in a way that is evolved, who's dealing with their trauma in a way that traumatizes other people, you know, and really kind of confronting the archetype of the quote unquote perfect victim, kind of head on, by kind of embodying the experience of someone who is grappling with this in real time.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the prologue did for me, you know, given the fact that, you know, the Me Too movement is in, you know, recent history for all of us, and that was a very public phenomenon where, you know, if you were sitting on the sidelines, I think it was really easy to feel like the right thing was that all this information come out regardless of anything else, you know, and that we were just on this absolute mission to expose. And I think one of the things the novel did for me was to make me think about the cost at which such exposure comes to those victims, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that when you're reading headlines and when you're on Twitter and you're on Facebook, there can be kind of this righteous momentum that builds up, which is so wonderful. I mean, the Me Too movement and kind of the explosion that happened is incredible. But I do think also sometimes in that getting caught up in the, oh my God, we have to expose everyone. It's like, well, that exposure comes at, like you're saying, the cost of victims telling their story in a public sphere, which can be re-traumatizing, which can be very intense and is not always necessarily fully healing, or it can be part of a healing experience, but it's complicated. So I think that's, you know, really important. And another, I mean, so I you know, this book is inspiration came from my personal experience, people that I know and love, and also a lot of research and really kind of following, you know, the Me Too movement as it kind of unfolded in the culture. And I will say, you know, going back to the courtroom scene, there's an incredible, devastating documentary called Leaving Neverland, which is about Michael Jackson and the kids he abused. And one of the people that comes forward is Wade Robson, who's a choreographer. And Wade actually took the stand in defense of Michael Jackson during his first kind of big major trial, when all these accusations of pedophilia kind of surfaced, and the first trial was happening. and then later, basically in this documentary, finally confronts, the ways that he was denying the fact that he himself was abused, to the point where he actually went on the stand in defense of Michael Jackson. So that was also like kind of in my mind, I think, as I wrote the prologue.
Mhm. Where do you weigh in on the debate amongst artists about creativity as a proxy for therapy, or therapy as a threat to one's creativity?
Oh, I think therapy is works wonderfly hand in hand with creativity, in my opinion. I mean, in my experience. I mean, I think. I mean, I've actually talked a lot about this book with my therapist. I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, for me, this book is not autobiographical, but there's a lot about it that is personal. And it is interesting to see the personal things that I was struggling with, questions I was asking myself about my own past, how they kind of manifested in this novel. I mean, I think when I'm writing and it's going well, I enter kind of like a subconscious, almost like dream state, where I'm kind of like living through the character essentially. So it has been for me wonderful to kind of talk through that with my therapist and kind of examine, like how this might be connected and why this was so important to me and how it might be connected to my personal history. And then as I work on other stuff, like I think because writing for me is so personal, it's hard for me to write something that I don't have a fiction that I don't have some sort of, again, it doesn't have to be literal on the nose connection to, but I feel like usually I'm asking myself questions that I'm also asking through my fiction. So I find therapy as to be incredibly helpful in terms of creativity. I'm interested that some people find it prohibitive in terms of creativity.
Yeah, there's, and I'm blanking on the name, but someone from the early 20th century who, sort of spoke out against, I don't know if it was psychoanalytical, psychoanalysis at that point or what, but said, I don't want to go into therapy because I'm afraid if I resolve all my issues, I won't have anything to work out in my writing, which I guess is, making a deal with the devil in some way. I mean,
But and I don't even know, but I feel like that sentiment also, like the idea that therapy is going to resolve all your issues and that like there's some sort of endpoint where like, okay, therapy is done, we get to stop looking inward. Like for me, therapy, I mean, yes, of course, like you're talking about patterns and issues in your life and trying to evolve and grow, but I think for me it's more of a constant kind of checking in and kind of self-examination and it's kind of like a jungle gym for my psyche. So I actually find it very creatively inspiring.
well, I don't know what you're talking about because I have definitely worked out all my issues in therapy. You'll get there, Jonathan. You'll get there. I'll still ahead. It's fine. So going back to something you said about, ignoring your past or, sort of sublimating your past in ways that it can come back and haunt you. I'm curious, in Jonah's past, which, he's raised in an evangelical setting. He has a history of sexual orientation change efforts or ex-gay therapy. And that is more than just his backstory. It is well, I guess that's my question for you, is to what extent are those forces still largely at work in the story of what happens to Jonah as an adult? Are the two inextricable? That is the drama of his adult life and the chaos and scariness of it sort of part and parcel with the drama of his adolescent life?
100%. I mean, I think that, he undergoes very intense spiritual trauma, as his entire family does, really. I mean, without really giving too much away, he has he goes to conversion therapy, which you learn pretty early on, and it has disastrous results for his entire family. And I think that regardless of whether you're gay, straight, whoever you are, if you've grown up in the evangelical church, if you've been a part of the evangelical church, oftentimes there is a lot of residual spiritual trauma due to kind of the toxic, rigid dogma that the evangelical church traffics in. I mean, I mean, whether you're a woman, Black, brown, gay, straight, I mean, they've got a laundry list of, some pretty toxic beliefs, which have, profoundly devastating effects on many people's lives. So for Jonah specifically, with conversion therapy, it is this kind of foundational trauma, which then really severs his ties with his whole entire family. So he is without really a safety net or support system. And that kind of family devastation, that lack of a support network, that lack of even a financial kind of fallback plan, that total kind of vulnerability that is also rooted in his spiritual trauma leaves him uniquely vulnerable to exploitation, to someone who can come along, someone older, like, Richard, the older man who he gets in a relationship with. Someone can easily take advantage of someone who doesn't have a support network, who doesn't have, a group of people to fall back on. And on a personal level, I also think that if you are queer and you have grown up in an oppressive religious environment, regardless of what religion we're talking about, if that religion is deeply important to you and an important part of your identity, but if people within that religious context are telling you you're going to go to hell because of who you are, that creates a fundamental and, in some cases, deadly schism inside you. I mean, that can lead to suicidal ideation. I mean, so these are, it's no joke. It's, kind of intensely foundational spiritual trauma that can have reverberations across a lifetime, as it does for this character, which is why I kind of wanted to show how all of that is interrelated.
We both grew up in the evangelical church, and I think that wrestling with what to hold on to, right? Because it's not all bad. And I think that's one of the things that Jonah sort of wrestles with, is that there are threads of hope and love that come back to him from his childhood, that he has to sort of sift from the abuse and the detritus of his religion. I guess one of the lines that stood out to me towards the end of the novel is Jonah writes, love is more powerful than death. Love will save us all. And I think that statement coming where it does, at the end of so much drama in his story, is not naive. But I'm curious how you would respond to people who sort of hear that and say, like, okay, well, that's cute, but like, we live in the real world, and like, the real world does not spin on love, it spins on money and power.
Right. Well, I mean, Jonah's experience with engaging with those forces of money and power, namely his older lover and abuser, are terribly disastrous for him. But I also think that, he does say that, but that's something that's very hard earned for him and takes a lot of emotional effort to get to that point. And there are points where he worries that love will destroy him, because the love of his family, I mean, it goes back to what you're talking about, the complexity, where it's not just like religion bad, non-religion good. It's like there are so many positive memories from his childhood with his parents that are not linked to that spiritual trauma. And so I think that he also has an experience where, lived experience where love has caused huge amounts of trauma and harm in his life. His parents, put him through conversion therapy because they love him. They're not doing it because they hate him. They're doing it because they love him, and they're under the extremely wrong-headed perception that this is something that they need to do for someone that they love. So I think that it takes so long for him to get to the point where he can even trust the idea of love, or wrap his head around the concept of love as something that's not wrapped up in trauma and abuse, because it also happens with his relationship with his abuser. Again, that idea of love is wrapped up with trauma and abuse. So I think by the end of the book, this concept of a love that is not rooted in your oppression, can be a beautiful love. And I think that is the takeaway. And I don't think that that's naive. I think that it can be hard to find that, especially if you're sorting through kind of the traumatic rubble of your past. But I think that an authentic love that is supportive and empowering versus one that's rooted in your oppression, that love can be real.
Well, you said love can be a destructive force too, right? And one of the other lines that I was really struck by is this idea that the things we worship eat us alive. And it's a line that gets repeated, and just sort of begs you to put the book down and think about it for a little bit. And I'm wondering whether you find that to be a kind of absolute truth. Is destruction the inevitable end of worship? Is it possible to worship something without being consumed by it? And is it possible not to worship anything? I mean, are we sort of doomed to being destroyed by something? So pick your poison. And I don't know if that destruction that you see as the end of worship is the same kind of possible destruction that love can wreak on a person, or whether you see them as different forces.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that is an interesting question, and one that I think is worth exploring. And I don't know that I necessarily have an answer to it. I think that when taken too far, I mean, I think that one, we all worship something, whether it's God, Jesus, Buddha, literature, Lamborghinis, alcohol. I mean, I think there is a natural kind of human inclination to cling to something for meaning. And I think that if you cling to anything too hard and don't ask questions and don't leave room for doubt, I think that can lead to a very toxic dynamic where you are being eaten alive, because you'll never have enough of that thing, but that thing will also never give you the meaning that you're asking for. But can worship also be transformative and positive? I think so. I don't think that, I mean, it's also, worship is such a hard word because it can mean so many different things. Do you know what I mean? I think that a worship that if you're losing yourself in that worship, I think that is when it gets dangerous. But I think that if that worship is helping you be more of yourself, helping you live into a more positive existence, that it can be healthy. I don't know. Mm. Clearly, this is something that I'm also still thinking about. I think at that moment in the novel, it's a little, it's a truth, but it's a cynical truth, I think, for Richard in that moment. But I do think it can be a truth. I don't know. Sorry, I think clearly I'm not. Need to keep talking through that one in therapy, honey.
Well, I mean, I think that is it sort of goes back to the previous question, right? Of how do you sift through your history of whether it's religious trauma or relational trauma, that we have a very sort of absolutist response to this as a society, where we just sort of condemn anything that hurts, and run away from it. And I think that a more nuanced response, where we're able to say, this was good, and I want to, hold on to this in whatever way that looks like, um, while I let go of some of the harmful aspects. I mean, I think that is very much at the heart of the question of, is it possible to worship without being destroyed? And like you said, it gets expressed as a religious question, but it is not just a religious question.
Right.
And I think, I mean, one might say that, again, just to, since we're sort of talking about, the evangelical background here, that, a criticism that has been levied at the gay community is that, we're just a bunch of sex worshipers, right? And I think that there are ways in which I wish that the celebration of sex that we see in, the contemporary gay culture, which I think is often really healthy and a healthy response to the kind of sexual repression that we saw throughout much of history and is still very much prevalent in many segments of society. That is, I wish that celebration had sometimes not become a worship, because I see people being consumed by it, right? I see people being sort of destroyed by it. And I don't know, I've probably been watching one too many, like, late 80s, early 90s AIDS faux documentaries in the past. Like, we just finished This Is a
Oh,
Sin, or,
oh yeah, so good. But I think that's why it's important for queer people to be able to, if they desire to reclaim their spirituality, regardless of whether it's Christianity or whatever religion may have potentially oppressed them in the past. Because if you can reclaim your spirituality, then you can work towards a place where it's not just Christianity versus gay sluts. Do you know what I mean? Where you can have a positive environment that both embraces spirituality, that celebrates sexuality, but can also be a community where you can go if you do feel like, for example, you are sexually compulsive, or any sort of issue you may be dealing with. You can deal with it on a spiritual level. And I think that's another really important part of this book. Again, it doesn't give anything away really, but that one of the characters goes through kind of this or not even starts out on the path to potentially reclaim some piece of his spirituality, which in this case is Christianity. And that was important for me to paint that. And because I think that a lot of times in the queer community, it's just like queer people have this idea that religion is just not for them and will never be for them and just can't be for them. And that's so not true. But I think there's also really understandable spiritual trauma that is built into so many people's queer identities. So I think that there is this resistance, but there also are more and more. I mean, I go to a church in Pasadena, which is is hugely affirming, has a very large queer and trans population, is totally accepting of queer and trans people, and is not only accepting but devoted to helping people deconstruct whatever spiritual trauma they've been through and reconstruct some idea of spirituality which is helpful for them. And I don't even self-identify as a Christian, and that's fine. That's the thing I also love about the space, is that it is a spiritual space where there is room for doubt, which are the only spiritual spaces that I'm interested in, are ones that allow space for doubt, that allow space for questioning, that allow space for power to be questioned, that that allow for a dialogue and allow for nuance, which is the opposite of the evangelical church. And I mean, it's interesting, it happens to be a church that is attended by a lot of ex-evangelicals. And so I think that there's a particular attention to going in the 180 opposite of the toxic rigidity and certainty and oppression of the evangelical church. It's kind of the wild opposite. So that's, I mean, I did want to explore a character who is at least thinking about reclaiming his spirituality and kind of picking up the pieces and saying, you know what, I can have this. This can be for me, because it is an important part of who I am. So
yeah. So I mean, in many ways, Jonah is a character who needs to be saved, right? Who desires or who sort of needs salvation from various things at various times. And I guess I mean, even his name, Jonah, right, is evocative of that story of running away and then being saved. And so I wonder, again, maybe you want to sort of not answer this because I don't want you to give anything away, but just generally speaking, what is it that you think Jonah needs to be saved from?
I think he needs to be saved. Oh God, that's kind of, it's a huge question. It's also kind of difficult. I mean, I think that he needs to almost learn how to save himself. I think he needs to be saved from kind of the understandably intense pull of all the trauma that he's been through, saved from the cycles of abuse that he's kind of been perpetuated, or that he's been subjected to and continue to kind of unfold across his life. So I think he kind of needs to be saved from himself, but I think he also, part of his journey is learning how to save himself, and to get to a place where he's able to confront his own story and start processing and dealing with that.
It reminds me of what you said about, love and worship, right? Which is that to the extent that love and or worship helps you be more fully yourself, they are healthy and wonderful. And to the extent that love and or worship forces you to be someone else or to suppress who you are, right? And so thinking of salvation as a kind of internal act there, right? An act of coming into one's own agency as a savior, right? Rather than sort of looking to something else out there to save me, the way that Jonah does at the beginning of the novel, right? Where he's got his eyes on this older man, Richard, as sort of like the answer to all of his problems.
Yes, you said it perfectly and better than I did. I mean, I think that, yes, Jonah is constantly looking toward other things, whether it's God, whether it's family, whether it's this older man who's rich and wealthy and going to solve all his problems. He's constantly looking elsewhere when, it's like the RuPaul, it's cliche, but if you don't love yourself, how in the hell are you going to love somebody else? Like, you got, it's doing that internal work, which can be hard if there are very real barriers of trauma that have kind of been erected and various kind of points in your soul or spirit or psyche that are saying, nope, don't go here, don't look at that, look out here.
Well, Jonathan Parks-Ramage, it has been awesome to chat with you. Thank you for your time. Show us that gorgeous cover of Yes, Daddy, out May 18th, wherever books are sold. And below this conversation on our page, you'll see a reading from that done by Jonathan in his own voice. And if you scroll to the very bottom of the page, you will see a link where you can purchase or pre-order your copy of Yes, Daddy through ORP's affiliate store on bookshop.org. And that does not add to your cost of the book. So thank you so much. It was great to chat with you.
Amazing conversation.